Okay, good evening, everyone. We are beginning our lecture series on religious Zionism, a Jewish history lecture series. Tonight will be our first installment. Don't be intimidated by the long source packages for your own benefit. It's a gift from me to you. You can take it home. We won't be reading everything, so therefore thought maybe people would enjoy seeing some of the sources for themselves. What I'd like to cover today is some of the history of what is known in the historical circles as the old Yishuv and the Proto-zionists, or Proto-zionism. It's had a lot of different names, it's had a lot of different titles, but really before the Zionist movement takes, on its, for sure before there's a state, but before it even begins, there are some early manifestations of what we would call desires for return to the land in modern times. Why did I pick this topic? First of all, it's just a very fascinating topic. Really, the whole story of the Jewish people's return and flowering in the Jewish state, in the homeland in modern history is really incredible, miraculous, and very unlikely from a historical perspective. It's fascinating. I thought it was very timely to what is happening in the world at large. And then in general, you'll see we may have some preconceptions or some perspectives on how we see the political sphere today and some of the debates and some of the issues that really are old and very well trodden. But if we look at the history and we understand where they come from, sometimes you can find very interesting things and you can gain a new perspective on the current events. So for all those reasons, I thought it would be very fascinating to explore it, and I just have a personal interest in history, and so therefore I'm just really excited to begin this new series. I think the focus will be history, but it does touch on halacha, as you'll see, and certainly hashkafa, but I think the focus will be history, and then and we'll take it from there. It is a 4-part series, but you can let me know if there's more desire for more, and we can discuss further lectures. Okay, so we're going to begin with what I know from my research is the first, as I mentioned, mass movement. It's not really the mass movement is the wrong word, but a large movement, not just of individuals, to move back to the land of Israel in modern times in the last several hundred years. And that really begins in a very interesting place, something that many people may not know. And that is really the history of the Hasidim, of the students really of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, we did a series on the Musar movement. We mentioned a little bit about the Baal Shem Tov in that context, but the Baal Shem Tov really was known as the founder of Hasidus, but really it only takes really off a little bit later after his passing. But this is in source number 1. A new history of Hasidism, and in this book they record that in 1777 there were a group of Hasidim that immigrated from Europe to the land of Israel. This band of immigrants, led by the students of the Maggid, right? The Maggid of Mezrich. So he was a student of the Baal Shem Tov. So led by Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, Avram of Kalisk, and lesser well known, I don't know who this is really, Israel of Polotsk. And there were some 300 individuals that, without getting into all the details, they tried to maintain their relationships with the Hasidim in Europe. It was a very difficult time period. The funds were very sparse. And one of the interesting questions that I'm not really going to deal with, but historians discuss it. How do we define really like the difference between the old Yishuv and the new Yishuv? We're going to talk about that a lot with Rav Kook and how he dealt with that. It's really hard to define, but one of the defining features that historians try to locate as the first Yishuv, the first settlement, is how they economically were sustained. And this was done through something called the Chalukah system. The Chalukah system, which is how the old Yishuv functioned, which was basically a distribution system that depended on donations. And the Jewish settlement survived on donations collected outside of the land of, well, it's hard to even, whatever we're going to call it, Palestine. It's not even mandated Palestine yet, but in the land of Israel, we'll call it. But it was basically very, very poverty was very difficult, very high levels of poverty, and not much income. And
but was it because they were studying, or because it was hard to make a living in the land?
So it could be a combination of things. I don't know. He says here. Many of the letters we have, so we don't really know. We have letters. Many of the letters describe the high cost of living and the difficulties of making a living. It seems like they were working people. There was also a plague that hit them. There was a lot of things that were very difficult. If you can imagine, settling in a land which was not very, it wasn't very civilized. It was not very developed. So they really organized themselves, and this is really what the word kollel comes from. They organized themselves into what was called kollelim, which were local community and organizational institutions that sort of distributed or represented each community to help their own. So like they have the kollel set up for that community, and they would go back to Europe, raise funds, and that kollel would distribute the funds. Okay, now it's a good question Miriam's asking, but it's more. I think it's more in depth than what I had a chance to research. But I believe it was all of the above. It was not. It could be they were less. Let's call them pioneering, as we'll see soon. They were not. That wasn't their goal, or it's debated. But the simple understanding, as I mentioned before, the distinction between the old Yishuv and the new Yishuv is the old Yishuv. Their goal was not to develop the land. Based on, we see their economic survival was, collecting. Whereas the new Yishuv later in history, their whole perspective was, we're going to develop the land, we're going to build, we're going to, that was their whole identity, was to be self-sufficient. Whereas the entire identity, maybe not ideologically, but just that's how it was dependent upon outside money. So the question is really, why did these Hasidim, and we'll see later, a few years later, the students of the Vilna Gaon, from the other perspective, from the anti-Hasidic movement, often referred to as the Messianism movement, they also came to the land of Israel. Why did these people in this 18th and 19th century, why did they immigrate to the land of Israel? Some claim that they did it for redemptive, some sort of redemptive process, messianic yearnings, as we'll soon see. Others say, no, maybe they were looking for their own, their own community and more freedom from the misnagdim. And this is debated. And this is kind of what I want to begin with, which is really this question of what was the reason for this original immigration. So, he kind of touches on this, but we can go more in depth. But he says that some view the migration of the Hasidim as an expression of messianic hopes, which were also found in the teachings of early Hasidim. Others reject this stance because of the silence of the sources, most of which contain no hint to such a motive. This is in the Hasidism, A New History, written by many, many authors. One of this, David, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but Biali. And others, right, they say that you don't see this in the sources. So let's get into this question, because I think this really is going to depend on how we define the first or early settlers. Were they Zionists? Were they Proto-Zionists? Did they have messianic yearnings? Or they were just sort of came together, said, let's find a new place, and we'll go to the land of Israel.
Were they the only Jews in Israel then? Are they coming in with no Jews?
To our knowledge, we don't have, I don't want to speak for all historians, but from my understanding, from reading the literature, there were no Jews in the land. Let's say, it could be there were, individuals. Like we know the Ramban was there for a time period. We know other individuals, but as in terms of a community structure, we don't have any record of it prior to this. Pretty after the exile.
What Israel are you talking about?
So they moved to Tzfat, then they moved also to Akko, different places. Some in Jerusalem. Different places. So Professor Ari Morgenstern argues that, and he's talking mostly about the students of the Vilna Gaon, they came very shortly after, in 1808, between 1808 and 1810, And he argues that, according to the Vilna Gaon, the Geula process, the redemption process, would not be a one-time event, but rather a gradual process. This is in source number 2. And in his view, we are currently experiencing the Ikvasa, the Mashiach, the pre-Messianic period, and on the historical timeline, we are standing on the threshold of the Mashiach ben Yosef. We will see soon, probably not today, but we'll talk about the Mashiach ben Yosef, but it is part of the redemptive process. And he says that, according to the Gra's approach, redemption begins with natural means. But for now, we're just going to ignore the fact that some of them were Hasidim, some of them were the students of the Vilna Gaon, but he's arguing that this early Aliyah, this early immigration to the land of Israel, had messianic yearnings. And he quotes a comment to the Vilna Gaon, who writes that the 3 vows, which we'll get more into also today, the 3 vows which are known to be prohibitions of the Jewish people settling back in the land of Israel, only apply to the building of the Beis HaMikdash. The Gra's authority, according to his students, stemmed from a divine mission placed upon him to discover the secrets of the Torah and to accelerate the redemption. Further, in source number 3, also Dr. Ari Morgenstern, he argues that the Aliyah of 1808 by the disciples of the Gra was a turning point in the history of Eretz Yisrael. And it underwent a metamorphosis, changing an abstract idea to actuality and concrete community of the Jews living in the Holy Land. The Olam's accomplishments provided the subsequent Zionist movement a foundation upon which to build. And it is fair to say that everything Zionists have built in the land of Israel, up to the establishment of the state of Israel and beyond, was made possible by this seminal Aliyah. And that will be, if you go to, I imagine, I haven't been there recently, but maybe if you go to the National Museum of Israel, or you go to any of the, if you go to the plaques in Har Herzl, if you go to any of these places, they will usually pinpoint the Aliyah of the students of the Vilna Gaon, or maybe even the Baal Shem Tov, as the beginning of Zionism. They will say, or modern Zionism begins here, and that comes from this perspective, which has become popularized by many, and we'll see soon, is highly questionable. But that is the first step that we're going to have, is this Professor Ari Morgenstern, who certainly is a scholar, but this perspective has come under much scrutiny of late. Yes?
But doesn't Zionism have an element of self-determination rather than just settling the land, like Jews?
Well, define self-determination, meaning they were not thinking in terms of government, but they wanted to bring, according to Morgenstern, they wanted to bring the redemption. They thought by being there and living there, and they were supported by others, but they were ostensibly building a community, that was bringing and hastening the redemption. Now, as was alluded to in the new history of Hasidism, there's a silence of the sources. There's not much when it comes to actual, clear, identifiable material in the literature saying, we heard from the Vilna Gaon, or we were told by the Maggid of Mezrich, that if we come to the land of Israel, we will bring the redemption. You don't find that. So where does this idea come from? So it's very interesting. In 1947, there was a book published by Rav Shlomo Zalman Rivlin. It was called Kol HaTor. Kol HaTor. And it describes, again, this idea of the mass, or not call it mass immigration, but the larger immigration of this group. And it describes with, messianic overtones what they were trying to do. And the book was allegedly written by Rabbi Hillel Rivlin. Rabbi Hillel Rivlin was one of the students of the Vilna Gaon, often referred to as Hillel Mishklov, Hillel of Shklov. There's a famous student of the Vilna Gaon, Baruch Shklov, but I believe they're from the city of Shklov, sometimes referred to as the Shklover, right? Hillel Shklover or Baruch Shklover. And this is claimed by Rav Shlomo Zalman Rivlin to have originated with his grandfather, Rabbi Hillel Rivlin. It doesn't really make much of a stir in 1947. It takes about 20 plus years for the book to make a stir. And when does it make a stir? It makes a stir when Rav Menachem Kasher publishes a book in 1969. And this book is called HaTikufa HaGadola. And in this book, as I have a picture of him on the side, you can see him. And in this book, he publishes as an appendix to his own book, Kol HaTor. And he says this comes from the student of the Vilna Gaon, Rav Hillel Mishklov. And this makes a big stir. Now remember where we are. We're about 2 years after the 6-Day War. We're in the wake of the messianic, emotional, redemptive process that the land of Israel is undergoing. And he publishes this book saying that really the Vilna Gaon, really giving legitimacy to the whole Zionistic project, it's not just, Ben Gurion and Herzl, it's the Vilna Gaon. I mean, the Vilna Gaon, you can't get any more, legitimate than the Vilna Gaon. I mean, the Vilna Gaon is, right? So, first of all, just interesting, just for a moment, let's talk about Rav Menachem Mendel Kasher. Rav Menachem Kasher, he used to be, or I don't know, he's still, but he grew up as an anti-Zionist.
So he grew up as a what?
An anti-Zionist, and then sort of, makes a total turnaround. He was an incredible Talmid Chacham, a genius. He wrote something called the Torah Shlema. You've probably seen it. It's like, 40 volumes. And it's an encyclopedia. Now, we don't really appreciate what that means now because we have, Bar Ilan and we have online resources. But this is one person writing an encyclopedia on the Torah. And he was everything, all the Midrashim, he collected it all. In fact, he was very close with Rabbi Dr. Leo Jung, who was, I hope to do a series on him. He's an incredible figure. He was the rabbi of the Jewish Center, and he supported many Torah institutions for decades and decades. So he was very close with Rav Menachem Kasher, and they had this interesting, I don't know how it occurred, but basically they had this project to translate Torah Shlema into English, and you can see a picture I included here where they gave it to President Harry Truman. It was seen to be like the modern work to make Judaism relevant. They translated it into English. I happened to be in St. Louis a few months ago for a simcha, and I was in the Young Israel of St. Louis, and I went into the basement just at Shal Shudis. I didn't go into the main. I just went off to my own corner, and I found 3 or 4 volumes, the original volumes of the English volumes of the Torah Shlema, and one was dedicated to Harry Truman, and the other was dedicated to President Dwight Eisenhower. I don't know how far they made it. I don't think they went past the 4th volume. But you see, Rav Menachem Kasher, he was like this larger-than-life figure. He was involved in the Manhattan Eruv debate. He was like this very interesting encyclopedic, literally wrote an encyclopedia, and he was sort of giving legitimacy to the Zionistic movement, even though he came from Hasidic background. He writes this work, HaTikufa Gedolah, celebrating the 6-Day War as messianic, and he puts in the appendix Kol HaTor. And this makes a very big stir. I'll just share with you one source. It's very long, but we won't be able to go through all of it. But, yes. So Rabbi Menachem Kasher, this picture of him you can see in the top hat. He publishes in 1969 HaTikufa Gedolah. He also published the Torah Shlema. He appends Kol HaTorah to his own work, attributes it to the same person that Rav Shlomo Zalman Rivlin attributed to, or Rav Hillel Rivlin, or Hillel of Shklov, who was a student of the Gra. He's a student of the Vilna Gaon. Yes, they attribute it to the Torah of the Vilna Gaon. You can look at the Sharblat. Kol HaTorah, Pirkei Geula Me'ir HaGaon HaMekubal, Rav Hillel Mishklov, Bo Chazon Nifla Shel Rabo HaGra, HaMefitz Or Behoyer Al Me'oros Tekufasenu. It comes from the Gra, meaning it's the students of the Vilna Gaon, passing on the tradition of the Vilna Gaon. They used to say in the yeshivas, kasher nishte kasher, because he was, he broke from the yeshiva world, but he was he was a tremendous Talmid Chacham, very fascinating person. So he appends this work to his work. And this made a big rash, a big stir. Rav Moshe Sternbuch, in the Tshuvas V'Hanhagas, you can take a look, source number 4, he brings this up. He doesn't name Rav Kasher, but he says that, this Rav Echad, who printed, this one rabbi who printed the work, he writes that, he supports his own perspective on the 6 Day War and on the founding of the State of Israel and Medina Yisrael being a redemptive step in the redemptive process. And he has a number of criticisms. One thing he says is, number one, he says, I'm not going to challenge the authenticity of Kol HaTorah yet, but he says everything that Rav Menachem Kasher says is contradicted by the Kol HaTorah itself, and he brings 6 different reasons. We're not going to go through all of it. He says it's all mu'urav es hadvarim. He mixes things up. Shiladaitu Rabbeinu, to the point where he's saying that the Gra or Ha'olam, the light of the world, Hagra, that's Sefer Tzaddik L'Vrachahu, Lu'umi. He was a nationalist. Shadarish La'amol Ifa'ol Laman Medina Atzma'it, that he wanted to work for an independent state, and therefore the conquering of Yerushalayim during the 6 Day War is part of this process of redemption that was begun by the Vilna Gaon. And he says it can't be, it's totally it cannot be, it's impossible. He says, I bolded some of it for you. He says, he quotes this idea of the Mashiach ben Yosef, which I alluded to before, that the Mashiach ben Yosef is not fully the Messiah, but he's sort of the first step of the process that is found. By the way, that idea is first found in the Kol HaTorah. And he says, fine, over here, okay. He says, Yesh lihistapik tuva ba'amitas hadvarim. We have to really question the truth of this work. Ima kol achein. I'm in source number 4, in the second bolded part. Ima kol achein yatsa mipi Rabbeinu Hillel Talmud Agra. If everything of this really came from the Talmud of the student of the Gra, I'm really suspicious that even if it maybe have some of it part of the Vilna Gaon's teachings, but the students added in their own ideas. I can't prove this to you. I'm not a historian. I'm adding that in, but he's saying I'm a rabbi. I can't prove it to you. I don't have the manuscript of the original thing, which would show, sometimes things get published, and there were people who wrote notes on the side, but the publishers and the printers later, they don't really know what's the original and what's the notes. Because again, everything's manuscripts. So you have the manuscript, then you have the notes on the side, and sometimes the notes get in. It happens unfortunately pretty frequently. So sometimes you can see it happens. So he says, I don't know, but he says one thing is certain. He says here, who was the greatest student of the Vilna Gaon? Anyone wanna? The greatest student of the Vilna Gaon was Rav Chaim Volozhiner. Rav Chaim Volozhiner, the founder of the Volozhin Yeshiva. He says, we don't find anything about this in anything that Rav Chaim Volozhiner wrote. He is the most prominent student of the Vilna Gaon. You'd think that he would mention this. Then he says something. He says we actually have, some traditions to the opposite effect. He goes on and on. I'm not sure how much we're going to do, but let's do I bolded a few things. Let's do the second to last bolded part. He says something fascinating. Yeah.
Would he be aligning himself with what we call the Soviet community in the early days that don't believe that Satanism?
Well, as I mentioned, many of the political debates today have really their roots in old debates, which is very interesting historically to look at. He's not aligning himself at this point with anything, but he does say in a moment, he quotes different perspectives that the Gedolim, he calls, or the Gaone Lita in Poland took to the let's call them the return to the land. So let's see what he says. He says, Rov Gaone Lita u Poland. He just says this movement of Zionism. Here, I'll just start from the beginning of that paragraph where I bolded it. He said, Achshav nitzayin od. He says, now I'm going to tell you something further. He says, B'tikufa mesiyemet od lefnei kum hatnu'ah hatzionit l'klal. He says, before the period of the Zionistic movement, which is like what we're discussing, right? The sort of proto-Zionistic time, Nichluku Gedolei Olam be'ikra mitzvahs Yishuv ha'aretz bizman hazeh. The Gedolei Olam, the leaders, the greats of our generation, debated on the concept or the mitzvah of settling the land in our times. He says, Rov Gaone Lito Poland, most of the leaders of Lithuania and Poland, he says they were very supportive of the people who went to settle the land. And they supported people who went to work in the vineyards and the fields. They said is you can go and live in the land and keep the mitzvahs of the Tuluis Ba'aretz, you keep Shemitah, you keep Truma, you do all these things. Beautiful, amazing. He says that was the majority perspective. And and they fought staunchly against any modernity, any what he calls impureness, powers of impurity. Umeid idach yisa, which is he doesn't say this is the minority opinion, but it seems to be what he's saying is the minority opinion, was that today in our times, many in our of our leaders in the exile in the diaspora, Eretz HaKodesh eina makom avoda melacha. You should not go to the land of Israel to build it up. What should you do? You want to go to the land of Israel? It's not about building planting fields, building a society. It's about living there in holiness, living there in purity, in just. He says it's not a place for work, but rather it's a place for serving serving God in a pietistic way. And he says that is Gaon Rav Yehuda Leib Diskin, rather Gaon Rav Chaim Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, the Chavetz Chaim. He mentions many, but it does seem to be that was the minority opinion. And then he says, he mentions the.
Jews lived in Israel during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, or were they not farmers and they had to work the land?
I'm not making any argument one way or the other. I'm just reading the source, and then we'll see. We're developing an idea. So I hear your point. I'm just so that was then he mentions the Kol HaTor. That would be I guess contrary to that perspective. And then he says, interestingly, a third perspective, which again is not the majority opinion, but was an opinion. It was most promulgated by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but not the last one, but the previous one, Rav Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, known as the Frierdiker Rebbe. He was misnagid le'oded v'lismoch bebinyan haaretz. He says, absolutely not. You should not build up the land at all. And he says, this is what, I'm not sure who he means, Rabbeinu Yisrael. I'm not sure who that is. But you should only work b'yeshivas the Talmud Torah be'eretz u'begola. V'lerov hatmiya mechaber shalonu mevi ki'ilu ha'admor zatzal hu me'ilu shesovrim shamedina hi ischalta de'eku'ula. I think he's getting involved in how he would count the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov in those who supported going to the land, if it seems to be that the students that did not carry that through afterwards. And then he says something very interesting at the end, which I thought would be important to read. He says, at the end of the day, he wants to leave us with a perspective on hastening the redemption, which we're going to come back to when we talk about Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher. He says, "V'chein mona me'anavim me'tzdikei adoros legolos es hamatzah bezman haMashiach k'mo miYaakov Avinu. Avol be'ikr dvarav al kol panim gila sheha sama mavis, I think, or maybe it's I'm not sure what that is. Yishtokik l'shlo ba'aretz hakodesh v'alinu lamod eson v'lischadzik kenegdo." He says, really, the Nevi'im and the righteous of our generations have revealed to us from the promise of Yaakov Avinu that we will be redeemed. And we really we yearn for Eretz Yisrael, but and we have to strengthen that belief that we will return and there will be Geula. However, he says, the way in which it will happen, Suras Bias Mashiach Tzidkenu Lo Nisbar Lanu. We don't know exactly how it's going to happen. And we should, he says, remain with Emunah Pshuta Tahora. We have faith, we have pure faith that it will happen. How it's going to happen, whether we should or whether we should not, hastening it, not hastening it, building it up, living just with purity, not living with... He says, I don't know. We don't know. We have Emunah. We have a tradition it will happen. But the main thing is that we don't know how it's going to happen. We have to believe it's going to happen. Hakol Sasim, everything's hidden from us in terms of the way in which it's happening. He quotes from Rav Chaim Vital, and he says, Aleinu rak lehischazek beyiras Hashem. We just have to have pure faith. Ulisrachik mikochas atuma, and distance ourselves from negative influences. Ad sheyiskale kavod HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'olama b'mihira b'mina b'karav. What I wanted to just emphasize from this is you see a few things that I think are going to foreshadow some of the debates that are coming, and I think he takes issue with this perspective being attributed to the Vilna Gaon, which we're going to see also from a historical and academic perspective. It is written in the year Tafshin Chaf Tes. Someone who's better at math will help me out with that. It's close to 1969. Yeah, 1969. Right after Rav Nachum Kasher published his book, Rav Moshe Sternbuch Zugen Stark, I think he's maybe almost 100. He's still alive. He wrote this like a scorching response or critique. Is that the word scorching? Searing? I don't know what the word is. Searing. I don't think it's the right word. Searing review. So you may think, okay, that's I think someone mentioned it already, that's the Haredi approach. That's what's going to anti the state. But I want to show you some academics who have questioned this. And that really is, I think they've raised a lot of serious questions about the legitimacy of the Kol HaTor. And that, I think, is found in a number of different places, but the best place to look is in a book, or actually it's a book of a collection of different articles, which I thank Ari Friedman, your son, for sending me. Emmanuel Etkes, he wrote an article called The Vilna Gaon and His Disciples as Precursors of Zionism, the vicissitudes of a myth. As you see, it's going to be his perspective. Etkes says there's no way that we could say that this can be attributed to the Vilna Gaon. So he goes through some of the history that we already talked about, that was published in 47, then later published again in 69, and he says as follows. He says, without doubt, the manuscript, this is in source number 5, without doubt, the manuscript from which Kol HaTorah was printed was written by Shlomo Zalman Rivlin himself, the author of Chazon Zion. He claims that it's from Rav Yitzchak Tzvi Rivlin, who is regarded as a great Torah scholar and an expert on the Vilna Gaon's writings. Okay, fine. Why must we conclude that the story that first appears in Chazon Zion is entirely divorced from historical reality? First, it is anachronistic, a transparent effort to project Chibat Zion movement a century back in time. In other words, it doesn't fit into what we know of that community. That wasn't what they were trying to do. It was just, let's say the Chibat Zion, the Zionist movement, trying to gain legitimacy and put in their history earlier. Okay, then he says there was no hint of messianic motive, nor is there any hint of messianic narrative in what his sons and his greatest students wrote about him, the Vilna Gaon. It doesn't appear in the biography. It doesn't appear in Rav Chaim Volozhin's work. Other questions he asks, very legitimate questions. He says the Prushim, often referred to, the original Proto-zionists who went to the land, we have their writings, we have their letters, and they explain why they came to the land of Israel. And they don't mention that, if I'm trying, let's put it this way, if I'm trying to raise money from people in the diaspora to give us money to support us in the land of Israel, wouldn't you think it'd be a pretty good sales pitch to say the Vilna Gaon told us that we're bringing the redemption? It's a pretty good sales pitch. I've ever heard one. So you don't see that anywhere. You see, like we said before, we're living b'kedusha, we're trying to keep the mitzvos, we're doing, the Vilna Gaon apparently told him to go, but the fact is he doesn't say this will bring the redemption. That is seemingly what Etkes points out, and and they were focused mostly on purity and holiness. That was their identity, and it doesn't seem to be a real what we'd call a messianic redemptive process. That seems to be Etkis's approach. I know I mentioned Morgenstern, so it's a debate in the historians, but you saw that some of the arguments that Moshe Sternbuch points out also are made in the academic world. Okay, there's a lot more to say about that, but that's sort of, I think, potentially the beginning of Zionism, or maybe not. Maybe it was just the beginning of Jews returning to the homeland. As we shall see, much of Zionism has become very much pragmatic, and that's a lot of what we'll see when we come into the discussions between the old Yishuv and the new Yishuv, the state, and how the Mizrahi gets involved. But whether or not they were there for messianic reasons or not, they were there, and they were the beginning of the modern settling of the land of Israel. Yes, Mark?
Was it ever looked upon as a practical refuge from the pogroms and anti-Semitism?
Maybe. I thought maybe BLA or Bailey or Bailey, I don't know how to pronounce his name. I think he mentioned that. Persecutions from the Misnagdim.
Yeah.
Could be, listen, it's always good. It's always likely that when things get bad, you try to leave. So I don't think that's. I can't, based on what I have here, I can't prove it to you, but it would make sense, although they weren't going to somewhere very promising.
But they weren't blood libels.
They weren't necessarily blood libels, correct? Yes, it's true. Okay, this brings us to what, again, we'll call him maybe a proto-Zionist. I don't know exactly, one of the, even before what we call Chibas Tzion or Mevasri Tzion, whatever we want to call it, before it really gets off the ground, you have someone by the name of Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher. Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher was a traditional Polish rabbi. He was a student of Rabbi Kiva Eger and Rav Yaakov of Lisa. He was as traditional as they come. He was extremely outspoken against anyone, what he called the modern preachers. They have this in the article source number 6 by Aryeh Newman. He calls them predigers. I don't know, maybe no one knows Yiddish here. But the preachers that would darshan in the vernacular. And he was a staunch traditionalist. And he said, any of these maskilic or enlightenment, messages or trends are illegitimate. And he was very a staunch opponent of that. However, Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher, and you can see a picture of him here, and he definitely looks very traditional, right? Not like the modern Zionists we would think of. He writes something called Drishat Tzion, an incredible work. We shall learn some of it together tonight. In Drishat Tzion, he has a number of things which he argues. We'll just see a little bit of a summary here in Aryeh Newman's article. He says here that he is yearning for Zion. It's not like a new thing. He talks about how he's traditionally always been yearning for the land of Israel. But in 1836, he writes a letter to Baron Rothschild, and he's pressing him to purchase land in Palestine from Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, not him, but an Egyptian governor general. And he writes as follows. To him, this is an important letter. Do not imagine to Rothschild, right? You can see what he's trying to argue, which is new. This is really a new thing. And Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher is one of the, if I'm not mistaken, the first or one of the very first to make this argument. He says, do not imagine that the Almighty will suddenly descend from the heavens and summon his people to go forth, or that he will suddenly dispatch his Messiah from heaven to blow the great trumpet of the dispersed of Israel and raise them up for them a wall of fire. The redemption the truth is, the redemption will begin in a natural manner, set in motion by human agency and prompted by the willingness of governments to resettle, and small proportion of Israel is dispersed in the Holy Land. And we're going to see some of this inside together. But Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher, he writes that in a letter in 1836. He only publishes Drishas Tzion later in 1862.
What he says about redemption sounds very similar to what Herzl would say maybe not using the religious terms, that we need governments, we need initiatives.
Yeah, so we'll see soon political Zionism. I mean, Tzvi scholarship was not a politician, but he was willing to, go to that measure of political machinations, and to strategize to try to get permission for the Jews to settle. You're correct. You are correct. So one of the things he studs in his sefer, it's beautiful, a beautiful drush which is quoted in the first siman in Binyan Sion, Rav Yaakov Ettlinger's Shilas Uchuvas. It's quoted there and it says something beautiful. We know of the pasuk in Yeshaya from the end of Shema Kolinu in Slichos, V'haviyosem El Har Kodshi V'simachtem B'veis Tefilasi Olosem V'zivchayem V'ratzon HaMizbechi Ki Beisi Beis Tefila Yikare L'chol Ha'amim. Right? We know that there's a song, V'haviyosem El Har, right? I lost much of my voice over Yant. Still coming back. So he says a beautiful pshat in this pasuk that we all know. He says the first step of bringing back the redemption is v'havi osim el har kodshi, that the Jewish people will come back to the land. What's the second step? V'simachtem v'veis tefilasi, they will go and set up mekomos hakadoshim. They will set up holy sites to pray at the kosel kever rachum aras hamachpelah. Then he says, Oloseim v'zivchem l'ratzon ha'mizbechi, which we'll see in a second. They have to bring sacrifices, slaughter the animals, bring the karbanot. And what will happen on the final step, the fourth step? Ki beisi beis tefila yikare l'chol ha'amim. Then we will build the Beis Hamikdash. 4 steps. Maybe this is the Dalet Lashonos HaGeula, the 4 languages of redemption. 4 steps in this perspective. And Rav Kalisher was not messing around. He said we need to bring sacrifices.
Before there's a Beit HaMikdash.
Well, yes, because that's the 3rd step. And he goes ahead and he argues this point. And remember, he's the student of Rabbi Akiva Eger, and he is he brings this question up. He writes to many, many rabbis. One of the rabbis that responds, we don't have his letter, but we know that, as I mentioned, Rav Yaakov Ettlinger, who was one of the great Torah scholars, one of the Yekish Torah scholars, Binyan Sion and Siman Aleph, the very first source, it's addressed to Rav Tzvi Kalisher. And he says, this thing that you're saying, where he quotes that whole thing of V'haviyosem El Har Kodshi, very beautiful thing he quotes. And he then says, well, this thing that you're saying, we have to bring karbanos. He says, well, we don't have a prophet telling us that you're allowed to do that. And he it seems like he's read Drishat Tzion in this letter, because he quotes a lot from his work. And he says, you have all these sources. I'm not going to go into all the details. I don't think we have enough time. He says all these sources that you cite, he kind of has a response within the source to read it differently. And he says, I bolded this part from V'haviyosem, but he says, based on there, that, it seems like we should be bringing the karbanos, but this would only be allowed once we have a prophet telling us that we should do it. He has a number of different arguments. Interesting, he says something that Rav Kalisher is saying, well, it'll bring reach nichoach, it'll bring heaven, whatever we're going to call it, a positive feeling from God. He'll see us. We're trying to come back. We're trying to bring back the redemption, and God will show favor to us. But he says, well, there is a Gemara that tells us that in every generation we're mourning the destruction of the temple, because if it doesn't come in this generation, it shows that we're not worthy. So how can we have the chutzpah to say, look, we're bringing the karbanos. You should feel good. Hashem should bring a reach nichoach. He says maybe it's not a reach nichoach. Maybe not. Maybe it's not such a good thing to push it. God sort of force God's hand, so to speak. And he debates this point about the karbanos, and he says, really fundamentally, we need a prophet to tell us to do this.
One second, the context though. The Rishon who wrote it, he was referring to carbon pesach.
Oh, so we're going to talk about that in a second. Yeah.
And this rebuttal addresses some of the general
Yes.
concept of karbanos.
Yes.
But for example, on Reach Nichoach, there is no Reach Nichoach.
By Pesach. Yeah. I'm getting there in a second.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I think I saw that in an unpublished manuscript of some work that there's an entry about this. So it's very interesting. In Drishat Tzion, there is a letter that he publishes from Rabbi Akiva Eger And Rabbi Akiva Eger quotes his, I believe I'm getting the relationship correct here, his father-in-law, the Chassam Sofer. And part of the letter is Rabbi Akiva Eger, and some of it is the Chassam Sofer. What do they say? So this is what Laser was saying. If you look at source number 8, he quotes from this letter. And he says, this is the letter from Rabbi Akiva Eger, the Gadol Hador, the leader of the generation. And he says, you know what you should do? He quoting his father-in-law, ask Levakish Misari Yerushalayim. I don't know if it was Muhammad Ali at this point. I don't know who it was. But ask from the government officials for permission, lahakriv, permission to sacrifice. So he's saying, sort of like, go find out. Let's see, It's like the rabbi, this is the best rabbinic answer. Someone asks a question, they say, well, is this relevant right now? Maybe find out if this is actually possible. So he says, go find out. But then he says something, this sounds like that was the Chassam Sofer's request, to find out if we have permission. Then they have all these footnotes in here. I'm not exactly sure, but Masada Rav Kook published the Drishas Sion with all these different footnotes. I don't know who's writing what. It's a little bit confusing to me. But if you just look at the top part of the text, it says that the next part is actually the words of Rabbi Akiva Eger, I believe. Sorry. That was all Rabbi Akiva Eger. Then he's quoting Rav Chassam Sofer, his father-in-law. He says, "Af im haya lanu rishus, even if we have permission, milvad ma shekasav chosni nero yair, that what he said that you should ask permission." L'nachon be'inyan bigdei kahuna betcheles vargaman, that you really would need the kohanim to wear the bigdei kahuna. This is a whole other question that I didn't really get into. Rav Yaakov Enliger brings it up about how do you know that kohanim are really kohanim? You need kohanim to bring the sacrifices. So he says, number one, what he meant to ask permission to see, that's only if you could have kohanim, and those kohanim have to wear bigdei kahuna. V'gam yeh rak to'eles l'psachim. And it would only really help for the carbon pesach, which is what Laser was saying. Ki karbonas yachid ein ban b'tumah. There are other examples of carbonate tzibur, but each one has their own issue with it. But something that we solve with the carbon pesach is it's a carbon tzibur. If it's a communal carbon, then you're allowed to bring it even if we have tumas meis, if we're impure. And therefore he says, really the only chance we have to do it is the carbon pesach. And apparently, I don't know for sure, I've heard rumors that there are people who do bring a carbon pesach every single year, as Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher Talmidim. I don't know so much about it, but apparently there are these people who do that.
Samaritans, you mean, or
Jews. I believe so. I don't have any proof of it. I only heard rumors. That's what I can't say. Where do they do it? Probably secretively, I imagine. I don't know. Did you hear anything about people doing that?
There's two different things. One is the Shomer that
Yeah.
they do it in a Pesach.
Yeah.
That's completely a different.
That has nothing to do with
There's
this.
others that they try to be. They don't bring it up to Har Bayis.
Right.
There's no way that they.
Right.
do that.
That's another problem, because you have to do it on Har Bayis. You're right.
Right. They don't bring it up, but they go through the process.
They do something.
Of a carbon and
Yeah.
things like that. There are.
And then he says another problem, he sort of brings it up, he's sort of backpedaling a little bit, the same line, Karbonos tzibor tzarech lios mishkele Yisrael. They had to raise the funds for Karbonos tzibor from the shkalim, from the Jewish people. So we don't have a shekel, we don't have a collection, we don't have any of these things. So he's sort of like backpedaling and saying, the Chassam Sofer did ask you to find out permission, but it's only really relevant for the Carbon Pesach. You have to figure out the whole Kohanim situation, which, by the way, the Bailim, the owners, according to some, they were the ones who slaughtered the Carbon Pesach. It's a whole machlokas, Rashi and Tosas. But he says, and it wouldn't really even be so relevant because you need to have the Carbon Tzibor raised by the donations of the Jewish people.
But not for the Carbon Pesach. That's why, again, it's Carbon Pesach.
Yes,
Perfect
yes.
Because that's
Yes, every family would, right.
You
Right.
didn't collect it from the thing, and if you had more or less, so
Right.
that's why he argued that.
Right. Yeah. I guess it's that line is not referring to carbon. He's other carbon and tzibur. Yeah.
What year was this taking place?
He says, Tuf Kuv Tzadi Zion. It's 18. Well, he published Binyan Rishon Tzion in 1862. So this is after that, around 1862 is when he published it. I'm just going to go through a few. We have a few minutes. So I mentioned to you that Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher was saying we should hasten the redemption, and that was mentioned in the R.E. Newman article. Let's take a look at some of his argumentation here. So he says here, Yesh, source number 9. We have to be lishtadel bechevres eretz nosheves. We have to be the ones to build up the land. He has a beautiful pshat in the Perek Tehillim, Chav Dalid. It says, Mia le bahar Hashem. Who's going to go up to the Har Hashem? Mia kum bahar kodsho. Nikich habayim avar levav. Then if you continue in the psukim, right, who's going to go up? It's the one who's going to be Zedor Darshav, the generation that is Mevakshe Panecha, the generation that seeks you out. And perhaps this is his Dor Dorashav was what are we Doresh? We're seeking Dorishat Sion. We're seeking the redemption. We're seeking Sion. And that's the people who are going to go up, but we have to be the ones to start it. He has another pshat in the, it says, Si'ur Sha'ar Rashechem, V'hinas'u Pischei Olam. But then if you look further in the psukim, the next time it says it again, it says, Si'ur Sha'arim Rashechem Us'u Pischei Olam. So his pshat is that the first step has to come from us, and then Hashem will reveal Himself and bring the redemption. But it's source after source after source, supporting this idea. And he says, like we mentioned the translation, but here if you want to see it, the source itself, he quotes a Zohar, but he says, we quoted the letter that he wrote to Rothschild, but here in Drishat Sion, he says a similar thing. He says, Ge'ulat Yisrael asher anachnu chochim or mechakim, that the redemption that we so yearn for. Al yachshov achoshev ki pitom yirad Hashem me'ashamayim ha'aretz. Don't think it's just going to come down from heaven. We got nothing to do. We're just going to show up. No, he says it's not true. We have to be the ones to start the process of redemption. Over and over again. Yeah.
There is a source for that it will come down, right?
Rashi, there's a Rashi. Yeah.
There is something to be said.
Right.
You have to answer that.
Yeah, it's true.
Does say that.
Yeah, there's a machlokes Rishonim, yeah. So who were some of the opponents of Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher? So there were many. One of the most famous ones was Rav Shamshon Hirsch. Rav Shamshon Hirsch, interestingly, in Chorev, which he published well before Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher publishes Drishas Tzion, so it's not a response, but in Chorev, which he publishes, I believe in the 1830s, when he was a Rav in Oldenburg, he writes, I believe he's the first one, I mentioned the Gimel Shavuos, the 3 oaths, he's one of the first ones to mention the 3 oaths. And he writes here in Chorev, source number 10, he mentions that when Israel was still united in a common land, they did not call themselves an Am. They did not call themselves one people for the reason that the common soil bore them all. For alone among all peoples of the earth, the possession of the land and ensuing organization of the state was for Israel not an end, but a means to the better fulfillment of their Jewish duties. The Torah did not exist for the state, but the state for the Torah. This is well before Drishas Tzion. He goes on to say that the Torah is the goal of our having a state, of having a place to live. It was for the fulfillment of the Torah, but not for its own sake. And he writes, our sages say 3 vows that God imposed when He sent Israel into the wilderness. Number 1, the children of Israel. This is a Gemara in Ksubis. He's quoting, but the children of Israel shall never seek to reestablish their nation by themselves. Seems to be, right, totally counter Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher. Number 2, they shall never be disloyal to the nations which have given them shelter. Number 3, these nations shall not oppress them excessively. So we will get into some of the counter arguments, but Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher would have to really explain, the Gemara wasn't paskin in halacha, right? It's an agadita. What does it mean? Were the nations of the world, did they also keep to their side of the deal? We're going to get into that, but I just want to let you know a very interesting letter that Rav Shamshon Hirsch writes to Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher after Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher wrote, I mentioned to you, to all of his rabbis to get support for this whole movement. And he writes to Rav Hirsch to emphasize the importance of what he's doing. And Rav Hirsch writes something so sharp. He writes, Ki es asher hema, this is in source number 12, Ki es asher hema limitzvah gedola yichashvu, that what you consider to be a great mitzvah, he be'enai avera lo ma'at. In my eyes, it is not a small sin. What you are saying is a great mitzvah. And he was very against this forcing God's hand to bring the redemption. And this is not to say that Rav Shamshon Hirsch did not support the settlements in the land of Israel. To the contrary, he raised money. We have letters, you can see it in source number 13. He raised money for the newly one of the new settlements in Petach Tikva. He supported much of the Yishuv, but he took issue with this perspective of we need to force God's hand. We need to be the ones to bring the redemption. He says, no, we have the Shalosh Shavuos, we have the 3 oaths, we are supposed to keep the Torah. The state is a means for us to keep the Torah, but if we don't have the state, it doesn't mean that we can't keep the Torah. And he was one of the first, to formulate his, sort of an opposition to Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher. But as you see, these are sort of the, and we'll probably hold it over here, but these are the, what's the word? They lead towards, they are the...
Prototypes?
Prototypes, or these are like sort of the antecedents, is that the right? Of later debates, right? Rav Hirsch was not a Satmar Naturi Kartanik, but you see sort of his questioning of this movement. Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher, he didn't see the founding of the state. He's in 1862, but sort of the perspective of religious Zionism and understanding that the state was a fulfillment of that dream. You start to see the original sort of conception of that idea historically in his work. So this is the beginning. Proto-zionism, the beginning of the story. We'll hold it here for tonight.
What happens?
And we we know that
Did he make his way to Israel, Rav
he tried. Apparently, he really tried, and he got very sick. It's a whole tragic story, but he devoted his whole life to this. He was not just he walked the walk. I believe he tried to make it there, and I think he couldn't. But I believe he did not make it there himself. But
He didn't have approval. He didn't gain approval.
he didn't gain number one, he did not gain approval from his own teachers. Number two, he was seen as considered maybe a little bit of an outsider, even though he was totally a traditionalist, as we mentioned. But he wasn't like he didn't become like the paradigm of where the religious communities were going, and he kind of I don't want to say they fell on deaf ears, but it wasn't, there's a reason why only in the 40s they published his work, and, Masada Rav Kook published his work, and, I'm not trying to doubt, he was a tremendous Talmid Chacham, but it never really picked up. The movement, as we'll see the next time, the movement really picks up with Chivas Zion, Chovei Zion, which happens really at the end of the 19th century.
But if we look backwards at those who were supportive and those who were less supportive, through the prism of history and the knowledge of the Holocaust, would we not say that rabbis who were more enthusiastic